It's 19 minutes, just coming up to 20 past 7 on Tuesday's Newstalk Breakfast with Chris Dunne and Ivan Yates. Well, Educate Together, the patron of multi-denominational schools, are not happy. They have said they need an additional €140,000, not a lot of money in the overall, in funding to ensure the continued opening of multi-denominational schools into the future. At an emergency general meeting, the organisation asked each of its schools for a minimum contribution of €1,000. Joining me now on the line is Emer Nowlan, Educate Together Chief Operating Officer. Good morning, Emer.
Hi, Ivan. Thanks for having me on.
Tell me about this need for extra funding. Are we talking about primary or post-primary or both?
Well, both. Educate Together has opened, I suppose, most of the new schools that have opened in recent years, in the last 10 years. Doing this work, we've incurred costs. These are schools that are provided for the country. They're provided for people in the areas who want to Educate Together schools. And at the moment, the funding situation means that the costs of that work, they're not covered by the state. So we've obviously been in dialogue with the Department of Education to properly fund this work over the last number of years. Just to give you an idea, so we've opened 4 second-level schools in the last 2 years. And obviously opening a second-level school is a huge job. You know, these are big schools. They'll have over 1,000 pupils in them when they're, fully functioning.
Are they brand new schools, or are they existing schools changing patronage?
No, so if you take the second-level schools, for example, these are 4 new schools. And so they're in areas of population growth where new schools are needed. They're in areas where there's been very high demand for Educate Together schools. So, the community benefits, society benefits, these are schools that are needed. Now, obviously, once the schools are established, they're paid for by the government. They're state-funded schools. The teachers are paid. The buildings will be provided eventually, although mostly they open in temporary accommodation. But there's no grant whatsoever for opening these schools in the first place.
But I would have thought, if you're building a new school, it could cost several million euro. You'd lose it in a toss. What you're looking for here, the money is fairly minuscule, surely.
It is. And I suppose that's the frustration that we have. I mean, if we take a primary level, for example, where we've opened nearly 40 schools in the last 10 years at primary level. And again, these are schools that are needed because of population growth and because of the huge demand that's out there now for Educate Together schools. There is a small grant that was developed, which has been paid since 2008. That grant for opening a new primary school it's either 9,000 or 10,000 euro. If it's paid now, that's a fraction of the cost of opening those schools. If you think of all of the work that's involved in finding temporary accommodation for the schools, in the community engagement, and, everything from applying for planning permission to holding public meetings, for recruiting a principal. These are new schools. They need to be run by people who, have the enthusiasm to open new schools. They're going to be a huge asset to their communities. So, there's an awful lot of work involved in getting the school up and running. And then that school is going to be there for 100 years. It's going to serve that community. It's going to provide a service. It may have 200, 300, 400
we're in the start, Emer, we're in the start of a new year. And, every department and every subset of every department, including yourselves, NGOs and so on, have a budget for 2016. How much have you been allocated in total?
Well, in terms of our funding, we have a number of income streams. So part of we're a registered charity, so part of our income has traditionally come from fundraising and from philanthropic sources. But if we look back over the last 10 years, somewhere between 10 and 20% of the costs that we have are covered by the state in different ways. But if we take the new schools work specifically, as I say, to open primary schools, there is a small grant available which covers, a portion of those costs, but nowhere near all of it. But really, I suppose that, what we're most exercised about is at second level, where, we're providing a service to the state, and at the moment there is no grant whatsoever available. Now, to be fair to the department, they have acknowledged that the logic, that there is a need for some kind of a grant. They're talking about providing choice for parents. They're talking about diversity of school types. So, they really need to make sure that the funding is there so that people not just Educate Together, but, anybody that is going to open a school for the state is paid for that work. So they have acknowledged the logic, but as yet we have been paid nothing. So, for the last 2 years we have been opening these schools on fresh air. So obviously that's required, huge efficiencies in our organisation. And, approaching our members, that was not something that was done lightly. I mean, we know better than anyone the huge financial pressure that schools are under. Our schools, many of them are new and developing schools. 20% of our schools are in disadvantaged areas. So, they're doing really important work with, and they've faced cutbacks themselves in recent years. So this is not something that we did lightly, but we have to be in a position to take the opportunity that's there over the coming years. I mean, we're approaching a real tipping point in education, and there's never been as much demand for Educate Together schools. We've got more than 10,000 children on our expression of interest list, and there is a realisation now that change is needed. I think across the country, people are beginning to realise, it's no longer acceptable that, parents in Leitrim, Roscommon, Cavan, Monaghan, Longford, Tipperary, at the moment those parents have no option but to send their children to denominational schools. And there is a realisation that this needs to change, and we need to be in a position to change it. There's an opportunity there to be taken. So I suppose we approached our members to plug this gap because this is work that really needs to be done. And we were really encouraged by the response. I mean, we're talking to schools. These are people who have their Educate Together schools. They're facing challenges. It would have been easy for them to say, well, look, we're all right. We don't need to open any more schools. But no, right. in fact, the opposite. They're willing to make a contribution because they see the opportunity that is there, and they know that there are families all over the country waiting for these schools.
Okay, well, we will be speaking to Janice Irvine, the Minister of Education, later in the week. We'll put this point to her in relation to the 140 grand and the need to have a specific grant for opening new secondary schools. Emer Nowlan, Educate Together Chief Operating Officer, thank you for joining us on Newstalk Breakfast.